share the right window this time. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I actually, in normal times, would be close enough to be able to drive to you guys. So hopefully next time I'll be able to see you all in person. I really love this talk. And I think for me, it's because constellations are one of the first things that really got me into astronomy. And I don't like the Greek mythology very much, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of that tonight, but I also want to share some stories from other parts of the world that you might not be familiar with. So I hope you find that interesting, and then I'm going to kind of bring that into the modern day and kind of look at observations that are kind of loosely based around constellations as well. So when I was a child, I first became into the night sky because of the moon, because my mum was a child of the Apollo era. So at all times it was like, oh, look, there's the moon. But when I was in junior school, our classroom library had this Ladybird book, and it brought the sky to life in a way that I just hadn't experienced before. And it's just, these little bears' faces are just so adorable. I found this book on eBay a few years ago, and I genuinely cried when I looked through it again, because it was not my book when I was a child, and I wanted it so badly. And I really loved the stories, and I loved the star maps in it. And that kind of got me sort of interested in the stories behind it and how different they are from different parts of the world. And a lot of those stories are kind of not just about characters, but about things that happen that are related to the movement of the sky. So I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of look through. But first of all, we know that early humans were studying the night sky. And humans, as we know them, evolved about 200,000 years ago. But we know from cave paintings that people were studying the night sky. And when I first wrote this talk, definitely the oldest recording of the night sky was in Lascaux in southern France, and that dates back to about 17,300 years ago. I did hear that they thought they'd found another painting, but it went very quiet after that, so I don't know if they found an older one. But this is the painting, the super, super old, and it's of a series of bulls. And somebody realized that you can pretty much overlay a star map as the stars looked all those years ago, and it fits perfectly. And it's pretty convincing, this. The stars are in the right place for the crucial parts, and obviously everything in the sky isn't bulls, but I just find it really interesting that these people have seen the sky and wanted to record that in a cave painting. And I would really love to see this in person, because I imagine it would be quite an emotional experience. And similarly, petroglyphs are found kind of scattered in deserts all over the world. Some of them date back about 10,000 years. And basically, this is a petroglyph from Arizona. This dates back to about 5,000 years ago. And this petroglyph is also depicting the night sky. So you've got Orion here, the Pleiades there in that lovely little swirly pattern. And it just matches perfectly. Gary Fields, that used to work at Kielder Observatory, I saw a talk that he did a few years ago where him and two friends just went on a camper van expedition around the world to find the best night skies they could find. And they ended up in the Atacama Desert, just three men in a camper van, recording their exploits. And he was saying that you can just walk around and find these petroglyphs. And even if they're not necessarily depicting the night sky, he said that he felt extremely emotional seeing them, knowing that all that time ago, somebody has actually carved this rock and it's still just sitting there for people to find, and still obviously weathered, but the carvings are still there. And there's another petroglyph as well from White Tanks Regional Park that depicts the supernova from 1006 in Scorpius. So obviously a new star appearing was a pretty big deal for these guys, and they recorded it in a petroglyph. So we know by looking at these things that people were studying the night sky. There must be so many records that are now gone that we don't know about, but we can pretty hand on heart be certain that our ancestors were studying the night sky from the very beginning of human race as we know it. Also in existence are lots of calendars, the oldest ones dating back to around about 10,000 BC. Now, I'm no expert on calendars and stone circles, but these can take different forms, and it may be lumps of rock that kind of align to something, or it could be notches taken out of a hillside that the sun lines up with on a particular day of the month and things like that. And these exist all over the world as well. Really, really interesting. Stone circles are also scattered all over the world. The earliest of those date back to around about 7000 BC. And again, they're all over the world. They're very difficult to accurately date, but we know people built them. We have 1,000 that survive in the British Isles, and that's the stone ones. There are also lots of wooden circles as well, like wood henges as people call them, and evidence for those, even if they've rotted, the evidence of the stumps still being underground are there for people to find. And it's really interesting. We know that most of them are attuned to the solstices, but really we don't really know what else the reason is they built these things. Most of the people that are at Stonehenge on the solstices don't actually themselves know why they're there, I'm sure, but it's just very interesting. And I know it's a very spiritual experience to go to these things. I know we've got the Rollright stones not far from me, and it's just so beautiful to actually see them and wonder, why did these people go to the trouble of taking these hoofing great big rocks around the country to build these henges? It's so beautiful. Obviously Stonehenge is the most famous, but as I said, there are 1,000 across the British Isles alone, and then there are many others around the world as well. So yeah, very, very interesting to study those. Not very portable though. You can't really pick up Stonehenge and take it around with you. But one thing that it was portable is the Nebra Sky Disk. And this has been back in the news again recently, because from February, this is going to be displayed in the British Museum as part of a Stonehenge exhibition. And I dearly would love to go and see this because I think it's absolutely beautiful. This was found by metal detectorists who were basically pillaging a cave. I think it was found around about 1999, and they kind of kept quiet about it for a while, but it possibly is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. And that is because it's the oldest known star map. Now, they think that this little cluster may be the Pleiades, Sun, crescent moon, Milky Way. We think there are definitely deliberate notches taken out of the side of this that could be used for something. But the crucial thing about this is that it's portable. So it's a device for measuring the night sky and whatever. And it's like the earliest example that we found of something that is portable of that nature. And you can definitely measure the yearly position of the sun with it. And there's lots of other speculation about what all the different bits do. And hopefully I'll learn some more about that if I get to the British Museum in the new year. So, so beautiful though. I'm really glad that this was uncovered. There may be many other things like that that are still buried under the ground that we don't know about. And another really fascinating object, which again was in the news recently, is the Anti-Thakira mechanism. And this dates back around about 150 BC. And this was an extremely complex piece of engineering, and there were so many interlocking cogs, and basically that sort of complexity wasn't seen again until the watchmakers of the kind of 1800s. So the people that built this, I mean, the amount of skill they had, it was just absolutely incredible. And there is this kind of perspex model that was made of it as a kind of recreation. There's obviously, it's a gnarled piece of stone now, but they've done a lot of scans of it and tried to find out exactly what all the bits did. And it is so complex. There are so many cogs that are doing so many different things. And apparently it didn't work awfully well on their recreation, but again, just such an incredible piece of engineering. This was in the news earlier this year because University College London have made this kind of 3D computer generated model of it, which is probably a bit more like how it looked than the perspex model, obviously, which was built so we could see inside. But so many interlocking things here and different things in orbit around other things. And you can just see the complexity that went into this. Such a beautiful object. And it really is very fascinating that something like that was built as long ago as it was. So again, the night sky, just so important to people. And that brings me on to constellations. And the Greek are not the only people that name constellations. And actually the earliest people that started to name star patterns were the Mesopotamians. And they named 60 constellations from the sky that was visible to them right back in 3500 BC. And loads of different cultures during history have kind of made their own constellations. The Chinese really liked small constellations, and by 400 AD they'd named 284, which is extraordinary. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the Chinese mythology in a minute. But what I find interesting about the Chinese one is that quite a lot of the constellations are named after, obviously these are all named after things that were important to the culture. So there'll be a market stall and the tax desk and kind of inanimate objects like that that were very important to the culture, but were important enough that they decided to name the constellations after them. And I find that interesting because in the Greeks we've got like a harp, but generally most of them are characters or animals or some kind of epic saga that's involved. Now, it wasn't until the 4th century BC that the Greek Roman mythology came about, and frankly, as I said, I don't really like a lot of the stories. I don't think the people involved with them are particularly nice people, and kind of making somebody infamous in the stars for the things that they carried out, I don't think is a way that we should go forward, for sure. But the people obviously at that time from the northern hemisphere could see 48 constellations, but then once people were traveling, they were able to add to that by traveling to the southern hemisphere. So there are now 88 officially recognized. In addition to that, we've got lots of asterisms, which is an informal name of a grouping of stars, which is kind of slightly different from a constellation. Now, when we look as a beginner, particularly when you look at the night sky like this, it can be very, very difficult to pick out the constellations. And sometimes, especially if you're in a dark sky location, a bit of moonlight can really help you, because I've been to dark sky sites and I struggled to find constellations that I know really well because they're so buried against background skies. But luckily, Stellarium allows us to draw the lines on and also allows us to put the artwork on. There are no two places at all where the artwork is remotely similar to anybody else's. Sometimes Ursa Major, the handle of the plough is the nose of the bear, sometimes it's the tail. Equally with Leo, sometimes he's a crouching, so the kind of sickle is the rear end of him, the other times the sickle is the main end. There's no right or wrong really, but Stellarium does have some artwork that you can put onto that as well. Now, I mentioned about how the movement of these constellations and how they interact with each other kind of makes it into the mythology. And this is just a kind of month by month guide of how the sky is rotating just at the same time every night throughout the whole year, made using Stellarium. And everything kind of circulates and walks around the pole star, which is essentially stationary. It isn't, but it kind of essentially looks stationary for us in our time. And this photograph was a real labor of love. I love star trails photography, but over a number of years, I had to restart the project several times, but I eventually managed to create a 24-hour star trail by having my camera in what I thought was the same position. Wasn't. It was such a nightmare to put this together. And I also chose something that grows in the foreground, which was really stupid, but I got there in the end. And if we had 24 hours of darkness, then we would get full circle star trails, but obviously we don't, so you've got to kind of fudge it like I did here. But if you watch a time lapse, this is a 10-hour the star trails time lapse. The pole star is moving, but not very much. Now, that pole star wasn't the pole star when the ancient Egyptians were here. Because of precession, the star directly above the North Pole does change slightly. But for the purposes of tonight, we just need to understand that the stars are moving, except they're not. It's actually the rotation of Earth that's moving. And the trick question for non-astronomers is, how long does it take the Earth to complete a rotation? And as astronomers, you will all know that it's not quite 24 hours. That 4-minute difference doesn't make much of a difference day on day. But if you go out at 9 p.m. on the 1st of September and then again on the 1st of October, you'll see that everything is shifted round. And that is enough to give rise to seasonal constellations. And again, that is kind of important with regards to some of the mythology. Excuse me. So Ursa Major, the Great Bear, you can see it's very difficult to pick the stars out here because I live in a fairly dark area in North Oxfordshire, and the plough is just about visible. Seeing the rest of the stars quite hard, so I've put the lines on. I'll get to the mythology in a moment, but of course, you guys will all know the plough is a really good way of actually finding the pole star, because that 7-star asterism of the plough do be a Merak here. If you follow that with the naked eye, the next star you see is Polaris. I don't know why, but when I do stuff with in schools and with beavers and cubs and scouts, they all seem to think the pole star is the brightest star in the sky, and it really isn't. It's quite hard to find if you don't know where to look for it. But the great thing is, within our lifetime, it will always be where it is. So once you know from your back garden where to look for it, it's always going to be there. And that's really useful if you want to do circumpolar star trails like I do a lot of the time. Now, the stars within our lifetime aren't really moving very much. You can see proper motion of some stars, but it's really small. But over a long period of history, the stars do move relative to each other. So that 7-star asterism of the plough, this is how it looks today. But 100,000 years ago, it looked like this. And in 100,000 years in the future, it will look like this. Kind of looks more like a plough back then. So whenever I look at constellations and think they look nothing like their mythology character, I kind of give them a bit of leeway, because the stars may have been in a very slightly different position. But in general, I just think it's a very vivid imagination, and you can come up with your own ideas of what those patterns are. But I think it's really interesting that like 100,000 years isn't really a particularly big time span in astronomical terms, but it's interesting to see how the constellations will change shape over time. Now, I'm going to talk about the mythology of some of these constellations now. And first of all, the bears, because that's the cover of my Ladybird book. And I just love the diagrams of these so much. Now, I don't read from a script when I do talks, but some of the names involved with the Greek mythologies, I just have real problems memorizing them. So if you see me looking down, it's purely so I don't say the wrong name at the wrong time. I'll just put the, oh, no, we'll go back. I've already got the artwork on there. So in Roman mythology, Jupiter was the king of the gods, and he was lusting after a beautiful maiden called Callisto. And his wife was very jealous, obviously, and she discovered that Callisto had a son called Arcus. And she was absolutely convinced that Jupiter was the father of this child, that he'd illegitimately fathered a child out of wedlock. So Juno was extremely jealous, and she transformed Callisto into a bear. That way, the bear will no longer be able to tempt her husband away, and hopefully her husband will behave himself again. But it kind of almost ended up ending in tragedy, because Callisto's son Arcus was walking in the woods and encountered his mum in bear form and was actually about to kill her. He was going to shoot her with an arrow. And to avert the tragedy, Jupiter then turned Arcus into a bear as well. And then both of them took their place up in the sky to form the little bear and the big bear, or Ursa Major and Minor. And there are many different variations of even just within the Greek stories, but that's one of them. I've also heard other stories where a bear had been thrown into the fire, then flung into the sky by the tail, and that is what gave rise to all the constellations. There are so many variations. One of my favorites from the Aztec mythology is a strife mongerer called Tezcatlipoca. Took me many years to be able to pronounce that. Now, the god Quetzalcoatl was a really good god. He was well loved, he was kind, he was helpful, taught all of the people a lot of good skills and virtues. His brother was Tezcatlipoca, and Tez was a strife mongerer and a sorcerer, and basically just caused a huge amount of trouble for humankind. And one of the things that he used to do was disguise himself as a jaguar. And on one occasion, he lost a leg when his enemies slammed his leg in a door. So he ended up having to hop around on a wooden leg. To stop him causing all of this trouble, Quetzalcoatl permanently turned him into a jaguar and placed him up in the sky where he couldn't cause any harm. And when he was in the sky, because he had a wooden leg, he was then forced to kind of limp around the pole star for eternity. So I figured when I drew this that if he's got a wooden leg, he needs an eye patch as well. So given the stories of him, he was such a absolute nightmare, just causing so much trouble wherever he went. I think an eye patch probably suits him quite well. But yeah, Tezcatlipoca, the strive monger. I just think it's amazing that one of the constellations is a jaguar with a wooden leg. I just think that's just my favorite mythology ever. Throughout these, one of the things I love doing with children is to give them a star pattern and get them to come up with their own mythology. It could be a character or an object, and remembering the lines don't have to be drawn in the same way between the stars. And I actually found it's quite good fun to do as an adult as well. So with all of these constellations, I'm going to show you what I think it looks like. And for me, I think that a lot of the stars of the Great Bear look a bit like a giant aardvark. So the McIntyre mythology of that is an aardvark. Now, Cygnus, the swan, a very majestic swan, and a lot of the mythologies around this are also linked in with Lyra and Altair, the star Altair nearby as well. And this is a very majestic swan, which sounds beautiful, but actually, again, not a particularly nice character with some of the stories that you read. But Cygnus had many identities and was probably Zeus in disguise. And Leda was the wife of the Spartan king, and she had unrivaled beauty in the kingdom. She was absolutely gorgeous. And he took the form of a swan, and I will say eventually won her love. What actually happened is far more grisly and not very nice at all. So I'll let you look that up for yourself. But basically, I've got another story from there, which I think is a far nicer one than rape and attacking women. And that is the story of these two gods that were really good friends, and they were both racing chariots in space. And they became so focused on the race, both of them wanting to beat the other one, that they didn't pay attention to where they were going. And basically, they got too close to the sun, and the chariots then melted, and the two gods started to fall to earth. And one of them fell through some trees, which broke the fall a little bit, but the other one landed in a river and was knocked unconscious in the water. The first friend really wanted to rescue the other friend from the river, but he couldn't swim. So he begged Zeus to turn him into a swan so that he could go in and rescue his friend. And Zeus was very moved by this loyalty. So he did turn him into a swan, and he did go in and save his friend's life. And Zeus, again, moved by the brave act, actually then, when the swan eventually died, Zeus placed him in the sky as a reminder of courage and friendship. I think that's a far nicer story than the other one. So I now prefer to talk about that one, really. As I mentioned, some of the mythologies, because this is spanning the Milky Way, Cygnus is kind of in this bit of the Milky Way. We've got Vega up here and Altair kind of down here. Going the wrong way. I should know where that is by now. So some of the constellations are kind of, they're obviously viewed differently by different cultures, and a lot of the stories kind of involve the Milky Way being a river of some kind and the characters being those stars either side. And one of my favorite ones is the Chinese Magpie Bridge mythology, and this is the love story. So if we zoom in here, we've got Xinu, who is a weaver girl, and Nuilang is a cowherd. And these two people were very much in love, and the star here, Vega, is signified as Xenu, and Altair down there is Nuilang. And this story, because these two basically were from very different classes within their culture, their love was forbidden, but they really, really loved each other. But they were forced to be separated by the Milky Way, by the river of stars, and they couldn't be together. But on one night of the year, on the 7th day of the 7th lunar month, a flock of magpies, all of the magpies from out the whole of the world, will come together and form the Magpie Bridge so that these two people could spend one night together of the year. And that is actually the origins of Chinese Valentine's Day. And again, many variations of this. I didn't draw this one. This is a picture by Warwick Coble, and I think it's really beautiful. I couldn't do better than this one, so I've included this one. And here you can see that the stars are broken up in a different way rather than forming the cross, the kind of a V shape of her dress as she walks across this Magpie Bridge. And I think that's really beautiful, bringing those two lovers together like that. And I say it's the origin of Valentine's Day for the Chinese world. I think that it looks just like a longbow used in the Hunger Games. I love the Hunger Games books and the movies, so it's Katniss for me, Cygnus. I think it looks very much like that. So Orion, another character that I don't think was particularly nice within the Greek mythology. Orion, we're kind of seeing him again now, definitely one of my favorite constellations to look at. And when you get a bit of thin cloud, you get really beautiful star color within the difference between Betelgeuse and Rigel there, just absolutely beautiful. So the mythology here, in most cultures, Orion is some form of hunter or a male figure of some kind that goes off on adventures. Now, Orion was the son of the sea god Poseidon, and he could walk on water because his dad was a sea god. So he used to kind of walk around the world, basically creating havoc. And he went to the island of Chios, where he got very, very drunk and attacked Merope, who was the daughter of the ruler Onipion. Now, understandably, Onipion was furious that his daughter had been attacked in this way. So in vengeance, he actually blinded Orion and then drove him away. So Orion managed to stumble his way to Lemnos, where Hypatius, I can never say that word, but Hypatius, he was a lame smith god, but he had a forge there, and he basically told his servant to guide Orion over to the east. So carrying Celadion on his shoulder, Orion walked to the east, where Helios, the sun god, healed him and gave him his sight back. Rather than just being grateful to have his sight back, Orion then decided to go back to Chios to try and get revenge on Onipion, but the king hid away and managed to escape Orion's wrath, which quite frankly was out of order anyway. So still going off on a rampage, he then goes off to Crete, where he started to hunt down with the goddess Artemis. And they were both extremely good hunters. Obviously, Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, and Orion threatened to kill every living beast on Earth. So obviously the gods were not keen on this idea. So Mother Earth objected, sent a giant scorpion to kill him, and Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, revived him with an antidote. But after his death, Zeus placed Orion and the scorpion among the stars, but Ophiuchus is midway between them. So this is why we get Orion in the winter and Scorpius in the summer. They're as kind of far apart as it's possible to be, and Ophiuchus kind of joining the two in the middle. So I say a lot of these stories are kind of linked in with each other, and the stories link in, and the position in the sky is all kind of linked in. I just don't like the Greek stories very much at all. But one I do think is beautiful is the Iroquois mythology. And this is this long ago in this area, there was a man who had grown too old and too feeble to hunt, and he couldn't do any chores, and basically had become a massive burden to his family and became an outcast to the rest of the village, basically. And he knew that his days on earth were dwindling, so he basically got a bundle on his back, a staff in his hand, and made a great effort to walk up to the top of a high mountain. Once he got to the top of the mountain, he began to sing his death chant, and that sound kind of worked its way down, and he was singing, basically asking for a continuation of his spirit into the next world where he could carry on. And his voice drifted down to the village below. All the people started to gather and look up at this beautiful song. And as they looked, this old man slowly began to rise up into the air, where he took his place among the stars. Once he got there, he assumed a new role. And his role then was basically he'd gained strength and power again. He was now carrying the sun across the sky during the summer months. And that is why we don't see Orion, because it's in the same part of the sky as the sun during the summer. So basically he carries the sun high, and so it gives brightness, it brings light to the crops, it brings warmth, and basically allows people to grow food. But as the winter comes, he starts to get very, very tired after carrying the sun all through the season. So when the winter wind blows, he loses his strength, and he then hands that burden to his son. Now, his son is really lazy and does the least amount of work possible. So that is why the sun is carried low, the days are short, they don't get very warm. And basically, the old man just takes the winter to regain his strength. Once the sun comes round again, the spring comes round again, he takes up that role of carrying the sun once more. And then once again, we have light and warmth back in our world, and basically brings longer days to the people. So I think that's a really nice story. And I love the whole notion that there is a lazy sun that can't be bothered to carry our sun high enough in the winter. So I think it's really interesting the way that they all kind of link together like that. I think Orion looks like a giant egg timer. We also have a cookie jar. If you draw the lines downwards rather than making this kind of egg timer shape, it perfectly matches my cookie jar, but I'm the only one that has that cookie jar, so it's not much use to anyone else. But I think these old-fashioned egg timers definitely look like Orion to me. I'm going to talk about Leo as well. And Leo is one of actually the earliest recognized constellations. And there is archaeological evidence that Mesopotamians actually had a similar constellation way back in 4000 BC. In Greek mythology, Leo, that's the stars of Leo there over in the east in spring from my back garden. And this is the artwork. And as I said before, sometimes you get the mane end here. Sometimes that's his tail where he's crouched down ready to pounce. Either one works quite well. I think it's funny that these characters could be back to front and still work. It's because they don't really look anything like their star patterns. But Leo was basically in Greek mythology was the lion that was killed by Hercules. Now, the lion would take women hostage. No living weapon, or basically no weapon wielded by anybody could kill this lion. He was absolutely invincible. So he used to capture all these women, lure them into the cave, so that in turn would lure warriors who wanted to be heroic and try to rescue these women. And Leo knew that no weapon could kill him, so he just kept doing this. Now, realizing that he must defeat the lion with his bare hands, as part of the many labors that he had to do, Hercules, or Heracles as he was called in some stories, but Hercules basically knew he was going to have to do this with his bare hands. So what he did is he slipped into the lion's cave, and when the lion pounced to come and get him, he basically caught it in midair. One hand got the forelegs, one got the hind legs, and he basically just snapped the lion backwards and broke his back. And that's how he killed him, and then freed all of the trapped maidens. So Hercules was then a massive hero because he'd freed all the trapped maidens. And Zeus commemorated this labor by placing the lion in the sky. I'm going to actually talk about Hercules separately in a second, so I'll leave that there. But there are also in Cimmeria, Leo was the monster Hubida who was killed by Gilgamesh. So there's some evidence of another massive kind of story there as well. So a very, very old constellation. And I guess as constellations go, sort of looks like the character that it's named after. But I always like seeing Leo in the sky, because although I love the winter skies, it's kind of a sign that galaxy season is coming. So it's really good fun. I think it looks like a mouse, and I'd never noticed that until I did this workshop once with a group of children, and every single person in the class that was given this star cluster to draw a character of, they all said a mouse, and I'd never noticed how much like a mouse it actually looks. The other thing I think it looks like are those push along cars that you put young children in. It just that's just what you kind of have in your head, that the sickle is a handle of some kind. It's really good fun to do this. Just put your misconceptions aside and just have a look at the star patterns and see what things you come up with, because it's very interesting to do. Now, Lyra, obviously we saw the Chinese story about Vega being the beautiful girl, but Lyra is a harp, and it's one of the few Greek constellations that is actually an inanimate object rather than a person. And Lyra is kind of above the Milky Way here, as you saw before, and that's Altair down there. So a really beautiful star cluster, and again can be hard to see on a photograph because there is so many stars in that area. Now, Lyra was the first lyre that was ever made, and it was invented by Hermes, and he made it by hollowing out and cleaning a tortoise shell. Then he pierced the rim and tied 7 strings of cow gut to it and basically made a musical instrument. But that lyre got Hermes out of trouble quite a few times. So when he was a youth, he ended up in some exploit where he stole a load of Apollo's cattle, and Apollo angrily came to demand the return of the cattle. But when he heard the beautiful music being played by the lyre, he let Hermes keep the cattle and took the lyre in exchange. I don't think that would work today somehow. I've stolen your cows, but here's a harp. No, I don't think it would work. It's also, Lyra was said to be the musicians, Orpheus, who was a great musician, one of the greatest musicians that ever lived, and it was said to have been his lyre. And this is a story that ventures into the underworld, which is kind of topical as we head towards Halloween. Basically, Orpheus married Eurydice, I can never pronounce these names, but he married her and she died from a snake bite. And Orpheus basically charmed the king of the underworld, and the king of the underworld agreed to restore life to his lost bride. There was one thing though, when he came to meet her again, he was forbidden from turning around and looking at her, but he just couldn't resist it. He walked along, he turned around to look at her, and basically he saw her once again rise up and return to the underworld because he broke his promise. So sad story. But in Wales, the harp is thought to be the harp of King Arthur or of King David. And actually Vega comes from the Arabic word al-Nasr al-Waki, which means the swooping eagle or vulture. Some Arab nations see this as a tortoise or as a goose. A goose is quite popular within some mythologies from the Arab world. I think it looks like an AT-AT. There is nothing at all that I can see other than an AT-AT when I look at that constellation. It's funny because it's similar really in a way to Delphinus, but the more elongated pattern just means it looks like an AT-AT. The next time you're doing Milky Way photography, don't forget to look for the AT-AT. I'm going to talk about Hercules now. It's one of my favorite McIntyre mythologies to show you in a second, but Hercules is actually quite difficult to find on a dark night. You've got the distinctive keystone shape there, and he's actually upside down in our skies. When you look at the artwork for it, he's upside down there. So Hercules was the son of Zeus, and he was the god of the sky and the god of thunder, and he ruled Mount Olympus as the king of the gods. And Hercules' mother was one of Zeus's lovers, who was a mortal woman, and we're going to come back to her in a second when we come to the Milky Way mythology. Now, Zeus took this illegitimate son and laid him at the breast of his wife, who was the goddess Hera, sometimes called Juno. And Hercules, like any newborn, drank like he would do. He drank the milk very eagerly, but because he drank the milk of the goddess, Hercules then became immortal. And the king gave Hercules 10 tasks to fulfill, and they were known as the labors of Hercules. But for 2 of those labors, they were disqualified. He did them all, but he had help for 2 of them. So he was disqualified and had to do 2 more. So in the end, he did 12 labors of Hercules, one of which was to kill Leo, which he did. Chinese mythology is really interesting because Hercules is actually split up, and part of the constellation in the southern part and part of Ophiuchus is a celestial market. And the line of stars across the middle here that kind of goes towards Corona Borealis, that is an office for registering transactions in the market. So obviously, again, very important for Chinese in the market. The northern part of Hercules was said to be a woman's bed, and that was reference to the emperor's harem. So yeah, I find it really interesting that the Chinese have broke this up in such a different way. And I guess because these stars are not that prominent, it's very easy to just see a different pattern and break them up. But just because our sky is broken up the way it is doesn't mean that other cultures broke them up in the same way. They just didn't. Everyone is really different. I think that this looks like a raw chicken. I haven't eaten meat for 30 years, but all I ever think of when I see Hercules is a raw chicken ready to go in the oven. Or if any of you are fans of Friends, when Monica has the turkey on her head with the sunglasses, that's kind of what I see when I look at this star cluster. But if you change around, you could actually see an octopus or something like that. There are lots of ways of drawing those lines, lots of different things you could do with something of that shape. So yeah, quite interesting. Now, I mentioned the Milky Way. I was going to talk about the Milky Way. There are some really beautiful stories about the Milky Way, but again, the Greek one, not so nice. So as I said, Jupiter wanted his illegitimate son to get strength by suckling at the breast of his wife Hera. So this version of the story is gross. Basically, he was placed at Hera's breast and he was already exhibiting legendary strength that he had, and he suckled so vigorously that he woke Hera up. Hera woke up and saw that this baby that isn't hers was suckling at her breast, and it was a reminder of her husband's infidelity. So she grabbed the baby and pulled him away with a jerk, and the breast milk spurted out and spread across the sky to form the Milky Way. So horrible. It's just so horrible. So I'm going to move away from that picture. Lots of cultures obviously view this as a river. There are many kind of parallels with like the River Nile, or whatever. There's lots of crazy conspiracy theories about the pyramids and stuff like that. But a lot of these different stories involve rivers of stars, pathways to heaven, or a track of ashes. The Mongolians believed it was a seam where two parts of the sky were sewn together. Sumerian cultures thought it was a giant serpent, but the Polynesians are my favorite because they thought it was a giant cloud-eating shark. And I need me a giant cloud-eating shark because that would be so handy as an astrophotographer when it's always cloudy when you get set up. So there's nothing about the Milky Way looks remotely like a shark to me, but that was their mythology. I also really, really love the Cherokee mythology. And that's basically a winged spirit dog who stole cornmeal. So they noticed that cornmeal was going missing, and they all waited up one night, and this winged spirit dog came down and started stealing the corn. And they'd all laid in wait with their musical instruments and drums. And as soon as the dog appeared and started to eat the cornmeal, they all suddenly leapt up and started singing and chanting and banging their instruments to make an unholy amount of noise to frighten him away. And he basically flew away so quickly and scattered cornmeal across the sky as he went. And that was what formed the Milky Way. It's so funny. The Estonian mythology is one that I really find interesting, and that is about a beautiful young lady called Lindu. And she was betrothed to the Northern Lights, who had come to visit and wooed her and then disappeared again. And he promised that he would return for their wedding, but he never came back. And this is a kind of story you could understand coming from mid-latitudes, because the Northern Lights isn't visible to the naked eye that often from mid-latitudes. And you can just see how this story came, that there was a beautiful auroral display and everyone was like, wow, that's amazing. And then they didn't see it again in their lifetime. And so they evolved these stories to kind of match that. And it feels a bit like that. Now, it's been so long since I've seen Aurora from here. So hopefully now that we've got another flare heading our way, we might get some more chances. But she was so sad that he never came back, that her dad ended up putting her up. He got the winds to lift her into the sky. And the Milky Way basically is her bridal veil flowing from one part of the sky to the other. The Shoshon mythology is another of my favorites, and this is centered around a grizzly bear called Wakim. Now, Wakim lost a fight and was banished to the land of the souls, and he had to climb up a mountain to get there. And obviously he was trudging, he didn't really want to go, got above the tree line, it started to snow, and he's just slowly plodding his way up. Then he got a bit higher, and realized that actually the afterlife wasn't as bad as he thought. So he started to run, and he started running faster and faster and faster. And eventually he was running so fast that he got to the top of the mountain and just carried on up into the sky. And as he flew across the sky, all of the snow that had landed on his fur basically just spread across the sky to form the Milky Way. And every snowflake became a star of the Milky Way. And I think that is so beautiful. I would have given Wakem a home. He could have come to stay with me. But I like the idea of the stars being little fluttery snowflakes. That's beautiful. Now, I just mentioned Aurora. I've photographed Aurora now from here a good number of times, and that's because we have a field outside our village that has this amazing unobstructed view north. That's the light pollution from Banbury. Other than that, we have a clear sky. So if we have a clear night and the KP gets to around 6, then we can photograph Aurora from here. And I've done that probably 13 times now, picked up on camera, visually able to see it 3, possibly 4. I'm not sure if I was imagining one of them, but definitely on camera we could pick that up. And this was the best of those nights. Now, there are lots of different mythologies around Aurora, primarily from obviously people that live further north. And the Cree Indians thought Aurora was part of life's circle and basically was the spirit of departed friends and relatives trying to communicate with them. The Inuit tribes thought that Aurora was the spirits of dead humans playing ball games with a walrus skull. Now, that sounds bizarre, but this is interesting to me because I've heard people talk about having an audible sound associated with strong auroral displays, and it's kind of like a sort of cracking sound. And I've never kicked a skull, but if I did kick a skull, I imagine that that crack is very similar to the sound that you would have heard if you got that sort of auroral display. The Nunavik island had the same story, but it was reversed. So Aurora was walruses playing ball games with the skull of a human. But either way, still, there's a lot of skull kicking going on. And I find that really interesting. And I really hope that one day I get to hear the Aurora with my ears and see if it fits what I think it now sounds like. Very interesting. Comets are interesting. They are kind of labeled as a good omen or a bad omen, and they are often associated with deaths of the kings or upcoming catastrophes or the birth of a great figure. They were thought to be attacks of heavenly beings, and a comet in 44 BC was linked to the deification of Julius Caesar. Norse mythology said they are flakes of the skull of the giant Ymir falling from the sky. And it's interesting because these comets displays are often associated with an event, but it could be 4 years since the comet appeared and they say, oh, the comet signified this birth. None of it really happened instantaneously. It's lots of different things that were kind of, it's a good omen, it's a bad omen, it's the harbinger of doom. And there's no mythology as such. It's more to do with them being symbolic against certain events. And as I say, people seem to assign a comet thing to a past event or assign it to a future event, and none of it really seems to be that plausible, to be honest. And what I think is beautiful though is that cometary forms, this is the Moang Dewey silk textbook, and I think this is absolutely beautiful because this was at a time where people didn't know that comets were as far away as they are, and they would basically, this is recording using information that dated back to 1500 BC. They have recorded cometary forms, length of the tail, how the tail looked, relative size, and then linked that with lots of different natural disasters that were associated with them. And this was compiled after the event. Obviously, it was kind of written around 300 BC, but using knowledge that went back way further. So we're into the territory here of making a lot of things fit. But it was a very legitimate thing to try and study this and see if there was a link with comets. Do comets appearing cause a flood? We didn't know then that there's no way that that can happen. So it's very interesting. And I think Chinese astronomers were phenomenal, and the amount of knowledge they had was extraordinary. And I really love this silk textbook. So not strictly mythology, but I still think it's worth showing that because it's so beautiful. sort of linked are meteor showers. This is a video compilation from our old cameras. We've moved over completely to the Raspberry Pi meteor camera systems, and we've got 5 of them, 4 pointing different directions, 1 with a spectral grating. But meteor showers, again, were often seen to be a bad omen of some kind. They were sometimes referred to as comet stars, which is interesting because they kind of are. They are leftover debris from comets. And the comet stars were actually recorded in the August of 30 BC, which was apparently a portent witnessed after the death of Cleopatra. And this is thought to be the Perseids meteor shower. And Perseids are also connected to the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, and sometimes the Perseids are referred to as the tears of St. Lawrence, and they were said to be tears of the saint. So yeah, you can understand. I mean, we have so much knowledge now, and even now I'm wowed by a meteor shower. So I can't imagine what it would have been like for ancient ancestors when they didn't know what this stuff was, especially if you get a big fireball that may have had sound associated with it. It would have been quite scary, I would have thought, before really understanding those things. I'm going to talk very briefly about some atmospheric optics because they have made it into different kind of parts of sort of mythology, sometimes into religion. Crepuscular rays, I love crepuscular rays. I'm obsessed with photographing them. They've made me almost crash my car so many times because I'm constantly looking for crepuscular rays through the clouds. The name crepusculum is from the Latin meaning twilight, but these are visible at any time of day. The name is a little misleading. But every single religious picture that you see of a saint has these rays coming out from it, and they are referred to as the fingers of God by groups in America. I know some of the photography groups I'm in refer to them as that. So that's really interesting. And another thing that may be connected with religion a little bit is the Helicon Shine. And if you go, this is the time of year to look for them. If you've got frosty or a very dewy morning and the sun is very low, if you look at your shadow, you have like basically this brightening around your head, and it's basically backscatter from the water particles on the grass. What's interesting is that centers around your eyeball, but if you take a photograph of it and hold the camera to the side, the backscatter is then focused on the camera. So as with all atmospheric optics and rainbows, what you see is uniquely your rainbow. The person stood next to you has a different set of rays hitting their eyes. So it's very unique to you and exactly where you're standing. And it does look like you've got a halo. I've got pictures of it myself, but they're not as obvious as these ones. So next time you're out on a dewy morning when it's sunny, just look for this because it's really weird to just see this bright patch around your head, and that's basically a halo. It looks like a halo. So I can imagine that's where some of the halos around saints' heads comes from. The Brocken spectre is one that I find very interesting. In Germany, the Brocken is the highest peak of the Harz Mountains, and about 300 days of the year it's shrouded in mist. If you are somewhere that's very misty and high and the sun is behind you, you can see a glory, which is these concentric pastel coloured rings fanning out from again around your eyeballs. If you take a picture of it, it will be around where the camera shadow is. But basically you see the glory, but accompanied by this massively long grey shadow. And this is actually the legend of the big grey man of Ben Macdui in Scotland, or sometimes known as the Scottish Bigfoot. And this is where walkers would kind of hear terrifying noises and there'd be crunching and groaning sounds. And if you are up in the hills and the wind does strange things, you get weird echoes of your footsteps and crunching on gravel or loose rocks. And basically you then turn around and you're kind of met with this huge shadowy figure that goes off into the distance. You can see why people were terrified. So I think that's really interesting that Scotland has a Bigfoot, and it's basically centered around this phenomenon. Also interesting are sundogs, or Pahilia, from the Greek Germanic word meaning beside the sun. And these are very commonly seen if you know where to look for them. They're basically, if you hold your hand out at arm's length, put your thumb on the sundog will be where your little finger is. So they're 22 degrees out either side. And this is really interesting because quite often, if you get certain conditions, you can also get these pillars going up and down from the sun and fragments of a parhelic circle that pass through the sundogs and to the sun. And this, of course, forms a sign of the cross. And so this is kind of this was represented in the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was the earliest illustrated Bible. And there is absolutely no question in my mind that what we're seeing here is the sun and two sundogs. I mean, or mock suns, as they're sometimes referred to. And it's the same on this bottom picture as well. And there was actually, it's often used to represent the Holy Trinity, but there was also a really famous occurrence of this before the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in 1461. And this was where basically Richard came out, was met with this kind of cross-shaped apparition and two sundogs, and he basically thought that it was important that they were all going to march to their death, but he managed to, the troops were terrified, but he turned it around and said it's a sign from God that we're going to be victorious, and they went into battle and they did actually win the battle. But it's written in history, he says that he saw two glorious suns, each a perfect sun, and that is what they can look like. They are very, very beautiful. But this is actually reenacted. Any of you that are fans of Shakespeare, if you know Henry VI, Part 3, there is a line that says, "Dazzle mine eyes, or do I see three suns?" And that is referring to that exact battle. So it's even made it into Shakespeare. In terms of the word sun dog, it's probably to do with loyal dogs. And pretty much every culture from around the world has got some kind of story involving twin sun gods or twin something. It might be dogs, two dogs that are very loyal, or two suns. Cave paintings going out throughout the whole of the world that depict two of something connected to the sun. So there's lots of different ways that that is depicted within mythology. So leaving alone all the mythology stuff, I just want to talk a little bit about constellations in the modern day and stuff that we've discovered in them and found in them, and just some of astronomy's amazing achievements within these constellations. So the word constellation means something slightly different now. So the sky is broken up into these weird shaped chunks if you look on a star map. So here we have Hercules. If you're talking about mythology, Hercules is this bright pattern of stars that is related to the character of the mythology, but actually this entire patch of sky is Hercules. So if there's a supernova in Hercules, it could be anywhere within this weird patch. They're all broken up in a very irregular way, but that is officially what a constellation means now. It doesn't just mean the bright stars that form part of that. One thing that I think is phenomenal is the Hubble Extreme Deep Field. If you basically hold a pin at arm's length, that is how big a piece of sky they looked at. And this was just such an amazing achievement, and they found so many galaxies in a pretty empty patch of sky, and relative to a full moon, that is how big the piece of sky is. And we know the moon is actually quite small relative to the whole sky. So it's a really, really amazing achievement. And what they did here is compiled, I mean, I think I've done well if I've been out on 3 nights and done some deep sky imaging, but this was basically a 23-day exposure that they worked on over 10 years. And in that tiny, tiny patch of sky, they found 15,000 galaxies in a piece of sky the size of a pinhead held at arm's length. So if there's that many in that tiny bit of sky that looks empty, it's probably going to be like that in all directions. And that is so mind-blowing to me. It's also mind-blowing that you've got a 23-day long exposure. I just can't even imagine doing something like that. But these are so far away that we're seeing them as they looked 13.2 billion years ago. So that's 8.6 billion years before our solar system was even created. So it's an immense amount of time and distance that light has traveled for us to see them as they were then. And if we could see that as it is now, it's not going to look anything like it did on that picture. But the deeper we go, the further back in time we're looking with these sorts of pictures. Now, our nearest star is the sun, and we do sometimes use the term astronomical unit for non-astronomers because it's a bit easier than saying 150 million kilometers. It's quite useful in terms of talking about distances within the solar system, because the distance to the sun is 1 AU, and that kind of makes sense. But if we were to drive, it'd take 150 years to get to the sun. If we flew there on a standard jetliner, it'd take about 18 years. Even the Apollo spacecraft, which obviously couldn't sustain anybody for 5 months, but that's the fastest thing we've built that carried humans, it would still take 5 months to get a human that far. So space is really big, and we are nowhere near equipped to actually do any kind of travel interstellar wise at all. Our nearest star after the sun is Proxima Centauri, or that star system, and that is 40 trillion kilometers away, so that's 4.3 light years. And remember, 1 light year is 9.4 trillion kilometers, so I'm not going to do that maths because it's too many zeros and I won't be able to say it. But it would take 123,000 years to get to Proxima Centauri, our nearest neighbor in terms of stars, and that is in a spacecraft that was the fastest we'd ever built. So I get very excited about exoplanet research, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but keep in mind that when we find these Earth 2.0s, it's going to be a very, very, very long time before there's any hope of us getting to visit them. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. And then there are not enough Maltesers to keep me on a spacecraft for 123,000 years. Now you're talking about generation ships and all of that type of thing. It's just crazy. The most distant star is 9 billion light years away. So again, 9 billion times 9.4 trillion is how many kilometers that is. So it's a really long way away. Now, a star within a constellation or an asterism are generally not actually connected to each other in any way. And this is something that certainly beginners in astronomy don't always kind of grasp, that those stars are purely making that shape because it's a line of sight effect. I made this model. It was one of the Sky at Night DIY projects that I worked on. It's one of the favorite ones I've ever done. This is to scale, not in terms of side to side, but in terms of distance. If you stand about 2 meters in front of this model and look at it, those stars are basically placed to scale at different distances away. So if we turn it sideways on, this scale here is about 100 light years. So even these ones that look relatively close are many light years away from each other. So we see an asterism and assume the stars are all together in space, and they're just not. They're nowhere near. It's really interesting when I put this on my turntable and you stand and you see it appear and then it rotates round and you see the stars are just nowhere near each other. And there are lots of animations online showing Orion from the side like that, if we could view it that way. So it's always worth bearing in mind that, because I think we can easily forget just how far apart these things are. We also know that stars are different sizes and different colors. This is the Owl cluster taken with our little Ritchie Crescent. Oh, it's not little, it's 8 inches, but compared to some telescopes, it's quite small. And it's a really beautiful cluster, but we have this magnitude scale. And again, the magnitude scale can be a bit misleading because it's a logarithmic scale. So if each one of these is 2.5 times brighter than dimmer if you're going that way, brighter if you're coming that way. But that means from like -1 to 0 is 2.5 times brighter. But if you go from magnitude 4 to -1, it's 100 times brighter. And this is something that, that obviously the fainter you go or the brighter you go, it's a logarithmic scale. So the numbers don't always really kind of represent at a glance just how different the magnitudes can be. So Polaris, as I said earlier, is not that bright at mag +2, and Vega mag 0, that's a pretty bright star, and Sirius, the brightest star in the northern hemisphere, mag -1.5. Venus, when it's at its best, is around mag -4, but then the full moon is -13. And given how much brighter the full moon is, that doesn't seem like a big enough jump, but it's logarithmic. So, and we have the sun mag -27, so pretty bright. And stars within clusters can be bound together by gravity, and obviously we have different sorts of clusters. We've got the open clusters and globular clusters, and I love the double cluster in Perseus. It's just, I never get tired of looking at that through binoculars. And then we have the owl cluster, which is an open cluster as well. So these are often sort of loosely bound by gravity. But if you, obviously the Pleiades, my favorite night sky object bar none, you also end up with this gas and dust. And I think we now realize that the gas and dust is not actually related to those stars. I think it's a line of sight thing again. I think originally we thought that the stars were born of this gas and dust, but now I think the dust is thought to not necessarily be around the stars themselves. Globular clusters are very different. They're much more tightly packed together, and you can get hundreds, tens of thousands of stars all bound together very tightly by gravity. They tend to be a lot older, and they sit just outside of the galaxy, kind of around the halo, and they tend to be more yellow in color because of their age, whereas newer stars tend to be bluer. It's a generalization, but yeah, globular clusters also beautiful. They're a nightmare to sketch. I do a lot of sketching, but I find those very hard to do. Also, I mentioned about the color differences within Orion, and you can sort of see it on some of these stars in the owl cluster. That's not an artifact. They show up much more strongly on photographs. And as I said before, a thin cloud can actually really enhance that. And I think they look really beautiful, but they are different colors. And obviously, the trick question to children is which are hotter, and obviously the blue are hotter, the red are cooler, which is the opposite of how we see things on Earth, because ice is always blue and cold and red is boiling water. But in terms of stars, it's the other way around. And we have the spectral classification system that was worked on many years ago. Was it Henrietta Swan Leavitt? I always mix up whether she did Cepheid variables or whether it was this, but it was one of the Harvard computers that basically devised this spectral system. And to remember this, is "Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me" is how I was taught to remember it. Mnemonics don't normally work for me, but that one has stuck. But the temperature differences between them are really stark. We're talking about kind of 3,500 Kelvin all the way up to 28 to 50,000 Kelvin. And they all have different spectral features as well. So if you look at them through a spectral grating, you will get peaks within those different elements. And it's thanks to spectroscopy that we know so much as we do about exoplanets and things like that, because spectroscopy is just like, I can't imagine where we'd be in astronomy without it. It's just amazing. Now, as we have different sizes of planet, we also get different sizes of stars as well. And the blue hypergiants can be absolutely enormous. If we have a scale to like 2 scale sizes of our solar system, Earth would be this tiny dot against this big sun here. Or if you've got a small bead and a 60 diameter gym ball is how I visualize it if I'm doing outreach. But our sun is absolutely tiny compared to Betelgeuse, and Betelgeuse is tiny compared to some of the blue hypergiants. So the stars themselves vary enormously in size. And life expectancy is very different as well. So the really big stars burn bright and fast, and the ones that we're talking about 150 solar masses, they will only live for about 3 million years, not only, but that's quite small in astronomical terms. These are the ones that cause a supernova explosion and then it kicks out so much power in the space of a few seconds. It's just incredible, like 10 billion times the power output of the sun. So they are the ones that really go out with a bang. Stars like our sun tend to live for around about 10 billion years. So we're not even halfway through our sun's life expectancy. These are the ones that form a red giant. So they start to swell and then they shrink down into a tiny dwarf. They don't have an explosion. And then the ones that are way smaller than our sun can live for 10 trillion years, which is just mind-blowing. That is such a long amount of time. And they are the ones that just slowly shrink and disappear when they go. So there's no fanfare at all at the end of their life, which if I'd lived for 10 trillion years, I'd at least want a party when I died. It's insane. So I always get asked how many stars there are, and we don't really know, but we do know it's around about 4 billion just within our galaxy. And all the stars we can see with the naked eye from Earth are within about 1,000 light years of us. Obviously, with a telescope, we can see stars in other galaxies, but in terms of naked eye, they're all relatively close, really. In our galaxy, our Milky Way galaxy, we are somewhere like this on the end of one of the spiral arms. And That brings me on to exoplanet discoveries, and which is an area that is very fast moving. And as of the 19th of October, we discovered 4,538. That's confirmed. There are other candidates that are awaiting confirmation. The top detection methods for finding these, the transit method is by far the one, and they are the ones that are going to preferentially find the bigger planets that are orbiting the star. But 75% of them basically are transit methods. And then we've got radial velocity and micro lensing. Those percentages shift slightly with each discovery, but that was the figures as of last year. And it's kind of vaguely around that now. And these basically, in terms of like Earth masses or Earth radii, they tend to favor the ones that are kind of 2 to 6 Earth radii. In terms of mass, obviously the bigger ones are going to be discovered more easily. That's just basically the methods we're using favor those that are higher mass, and particularly when you're looking at the wobble on the star caused by a planet in orbit, then the radial velocity method, that is going to preferentially favor the bigger planets because that's going to have the biggest amount of pull on the star. But there are going to be so many other smaller planets that we discover once those detection methods improve. I wanted to show this video because it shows you, this is the whole sky mapped with the Milky Way running through it. And just press play on that, and it shows you where the stars have appeared relative to the rest of the sky. And I think it's really interesting because the first one, at first they're just kind of appearing slowly, and then it suddenly starts to go a little bit crazy. You just see these dots appearing. I'm not sure if you'd be able to hear the music, but it's got some piano music as well. But I find it interesting just seeing where they're spread out throughout the whole sky. And they're starting to appear much more quickly now. This is a little out of date, this video. This was the first 4,000. We're obviously getting closer to 5,000 now, but they're everywhere, basically. The take-home message here is that everywhere we look, there are exoplanets. And I can still remember the excitement when they discovered the first one, because the minute you find one other, you know that it's widespread. And I think the same will happen with life. The minute we find microbial life in one other place, we know that it's going to be everywhere. So this is all of the exoplanets, the first 4,000 exoplanets, where they are on the night sky. So obviously, because we're seeing just the detection methods that we're using, primarily most of them were kind of out this way, and some of them were kind of out this way, but primarily most of the most distant exoplanet was about 13,000 light years away. Preferentially, they were all kind of within this area, most of them within about 4,000 light years. But just this week, we found out that the Chandra X-ray telescope has found evidence for the first extragalactic exoplanet. I'm not surprised they're there at all. They're obviously going to be there. But the fact that we're able to find an exoplanet in another galaxy is just so mind-blowing to me. So this one was, it's in M51. This is my pastel sketch of M51. And basically, it's a sun-like star that is in orbit around an X-ray binary system. So it's 28 million light years away. I mean, that is so far away to find a little planet orbiting a small star. I mean, it's amazing. And it's just proof that this technique can work. So once we start looking for these in the X-ray wavelengths, we're going to be able to find exoplanets in all other galaxies. And this is so exciting to me. It's like how excited I felt the first time we found an exoplanet. Now we've found exoplanets outside of our own galaxy. It's just amazing. Now, as I said, we're not going to be able to go to any of these places, but I still think it's so amazing that we've achieved that. So just to finish up, what do these constellations mean to me now? The night sky and the constellations are where I go to de-stress. They're where I go to try and perfect my imaging. They're where I go to try to perfect my sketching techniques. They're just where I push myself to do better at everything that I try to do, where I try to improve my photography methods, my observing methods. There's just so much good in the night sky for me, and I never, ever get tired of it. And it's just such an amazing place to be. And I'm one of those people that prefers to do it by myself. My husband's an astronomer as well, and we do observe together sometimes, but I love being out there alone under the stars. I just find it so relaxing, so mindful, and just so beautiful. But still to this day, when I see Ursa Minor, I'm seeing this tiny little bear's face smiling down at me. And honestly, this book is so special to me because it's kind of where it started. And I can't look at this book and not smile. It's just so amazing. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope I didn't overrun too much. There's so much interesting stuff here that I didn't want to drop any of it out. And as we're on Zoom, we're not under as much time pressure. So if anyone has any questions